President, please be seated. The court is now back in session, and the floor is given to lead co-lawyers for civil parties to put question to the expert. You may now proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have about 15 minutes left. Some experts, in order to return to Nuon Chia's statement in 2013 before this court, and the fact that today he still believes that the agents infiltrated by the Vietnamese and the Americans are responsible for what happened during the DK regime and betrayed the revolution. Well, I would like to get your feedback on this. You studied the political culture of these Marxist-Leninist regimes. So is there an incapacity, an intrinsic incapacity in these regimes to question themselves and to say that maybe they went down the wrong path? And is there always a systematic recourse to the enemy to explain one's failures? Is the enemy always used as an excuse to explain one's failures?
Yes, that's true. I'd like to point out that Nuon Chia has used the example of the Americans sending agents to penetrate the party. As somebody who is sympathetic to the United States, that one wishes that the Americans had such a capacity. During the entire Vietnam War, they never once penetrated very high in the top leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party, despite the fact that they had 20 years to prepare themselves and to carry out such penetrations. They were never able to penetrate the Vietnamese Communist Party, in spite of the fact that they had very active Vietnamese allies working with them. How could they possibly have penetrated Kampuchea when they had such a limited involvement in Cambodia even during the war? They had no resources. The Americans are simply incapable of doing such a thing. Even if they would love to do it, they do not have the capacity. They have not shown the capacity to penetrate revolutionary states. But I think that the explanation, as you say, of what went wrong in democratic Kampuchea is to blame foreign enemies influencing local cadres, and this seems to me to be does reflect an inability to question one's own judgments. There is, despite talk about criticism and self-criticism in the Maoist ideology, there's very little capacity of the top leader to criticize himself.
Thank you. During the hearings, we referred to Sao Pim. You talk about him in your book, referring to a detail which, if I'm not mistaken, has not yet been dealt with in these hearings. On pages 109 and 110 of your book, the year ends as 01001776 and 1777. You refer to efforts made by Le Duan to find Le Rom. The name of Sao Pim is referred to in your book. The fact that is to find the Yaman, beg your pardon. Sao Pim said the Communist Party of Vietnam had tried to contact Sao Pim, whereas that person had already died 3 months before. And I understand from this that there were no contact between Sao Pim and Vietnam prior to his suicide. Can you explain to the Chamber this event, which you refer to or report in your book?
Yes, well, I mean, I brought this up as an example of the inability of the Vietnamese to know what was actually going on in Cambodia if they had tried to contact Sao Pim long after he had died. You know, as with the case of the judgment of Nguyen Chia as being our man and my personal friend, I think it reflects a lack of competence in what was going on in democratic Kampuchea, you know, rather than a regime which knew everything that was going on and was very capable.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. We've talked about conspiracies during these 3 days of hearings. I would like you once more to react to statements made by Nguyen Chia through his counsel in the submissions made, which we received from the parties in this trial. And I would like you to react to Nguyen Chia's theory regarding crimes of political persecution, which are intrinsically purges. And we have in this trial crimes of political persecution related to 3 security centers. And I'll read out to you what Nguyen Chia thinks about these crimes. This is E395.2/2, paragraph 27. And as regards these potential crimes of political persecution, alleged political crimes, Nguyen Chia's counsel say as follows regarding attempted acts of aggression. This would demonstrate
that a substantial number of people were not at all persecuted on the basis of real or perceived political beliefs, but instead because of legitimate suspicions of their involvement in the grave crime of treason, including through preparatory acts, attempts at rebellion, and acts of sabotage. It is the defense position that such evidence would at least partially absolve Nguyen Chia of responsibility for this charge. Je voudrais vous citer un deux.
I would like to read out to you a second extract of this memorandum filed by the Nguyen Chia defense team, still E395/2, in which the lawyers present their defense strategy for defending Nguyen Chia, and this is what they state in English.
It is the defense case that it was the leaders of the treasonous rebellion who were responsible for death and other criminal acts in areas under their control. Même question finalement.
Same question as the one I asked before. This strategy of defense that hasn't changed after 40 years. What would you say regarding the capacity of the leaders of democratic Kampuchea to question themselves, to question what they did?
President, Mr. Expert, please hold on. You may now proceed. Copper.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Very interesting questions, and I think it's the first time ever that in this courtroom a defense position is being put before a witness or an expert. I'm not sure if that's entirely appropriate to do so. However, I'm still thinking of how to respond to this. But what is more important, and that is actually my observation leading to an objection, is that these conclusions are based on, we believe, a wealth of evidence suggesting various coup d'etat attempts coming from witnesses testifying in this courtroom, coming from contemporaneous documents, coming from the work of filmmaker Robert Lemkin. It would be only fair to confront the expert with the underlying sources, rather than the conclusions that we made on the basis of these sources.
Je retire ma question.
I would withdraw my question, Mr. President. I think the objection is perhaps as interesting as the question I put to the expert. I have 5 minutes to put questions to you regarding what you refer to yourself as hyper-Maoism. And in your book on page 17, 01000686, you appear to link this concept of hyper-Maoism with the delirium of the CPK to go further and to do better than the Chinese. And they have a feeling or sense of inferiority on the part of the Cambodians. If I understood your thesis correctly, can you explain to the chamber what you understand by this link you establish between this feeling of inferiority and the need to always go further and to do better?
Yes, that's why that's what I attributed to what I called hyper-Maoism, which was an extreme form of Maoism, concentrated and accelerated in its pace into a very small, short period of time. I think that the Cambodians have always suffered from their relationship with Vietnam and the sense that the Vietnamese look down upon them. I think that they certainly deferred to Mao Zedong and to Kim Il-sung of North Korea. But they believed that they had to prove themselves as authentic and, in fact, great communists by doing what Mao had done, but much quicker and in a much more concentrated way. Cambodia also suffers from the fact that it's a small country, and most small countries feel some sense of inferiority with regard to bigger countries with whom they are in some kind of competitive relationship. But amongst, shall we say, ideological movements, there is always this sense of trying to be purer than the other, to prove one's moral purity. And I think that goes a long way to explaining what happened in democratic Kampuchea. I use the word moral in their own terms, not necessarily in my terms.
Je vous remercie et ce sera...
Thank you, and this will be my last question. Do you see a link between the speed with which the revolutionary project was carried out in democratic Kampuchea and the alleged crimes? Which are the crimes this trial or the chamber has to consider in this trial?
Yes, I agree. I think that there is a relationship. The attempt to eliminate all distinct social classes, ethnic groups, social strata, the elimination of difference in society, cultural difference, political difference, economic difference, the elimination of that and to create a kind of monolithic society is goes a long way to explaining why things were done the way they did. For example, there's very little, when I say hyper-Maoism, there was very little few examples of re-education. The concept of re-education in the Chinese, which is ideological remolding, in democratic Kampuchea. It was more, the enemy is caught, they are not forgivable, and that they have to be eliminated, smashed, to use the words, smashed immediately. And this is all part of the rush to create the communist utopia.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur l'expert.
Thank you, Mr. Expert, for your answers. Thank you, Mr. President. I am done.
President, thank you. And now the Chamber gives the floor to the defense team for Mr. Kyosompon to put questions to the expert. You may now proceed.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Morris. My name is Anta Gise, and I'm International Counsel for Mr. Kyosompon. Together with my colleague, Kong Samon, I will put some supplementary questions on a number of issues you have dealt with, and I'll ask you to make some clarifications. I'll also look at a few documents with you. First of all, I would like us to revisit your research on the Soviet archives in relation to your book. Is it correct to say that the most important points, the most important sources that you used in writing your book are the Soviet archives?
Yes, that is correct.
Dans le cadre de...
As part of the Soviet archives, you explained that you were very fortunate to have access to a whole hodgepodge of documents, and you had indexes that enabled you to find the documents that were relevant to you. I don't know whether among those documents were documents dealing with or referring to direct discussions between the members of the Soviet diplomacy and other persons, that is, direct discussions with officials of democratic Kampuchea.
You're asking me if I found evidence of documents of discussion between officials of which country and democratic Kampuchea?
You explained that you found in those archives diplomatic reports of the Soviet Union at the time. My question is whether in those reports you found any details regarding discussions, regardless of the speakers, between Russians and officials of democratic Kampuchea. Did you have any direct information regarding reports and relations between Vietnam and other persons in Cambodia?
I have no record of discussions between officials of the former Soviet Union and democratic Kampuchea, only conversations between officials of the former Soviet Union and the leadership of Vietnam.
Donc, si je comprends...
So if I understand you correctly, when you used those archives to establish the positions of democratic Kampuchea and what Vietnam said regarding the position of democratic Kampuchea to the Soviet authorities, is that correct?
Yes, I was only using those documents with regard to what the Vietnamese perceived to be the situation in Kampuchea, not necessarily the reality. As I've pointed out, in some of my other testimony, I don't believe that the Vietnamese fully understood the situation inside democratic Kampuchea, nor did they fully understand the real attitudes of the leadership of democratic Kampuchea.
Et ma question sera...
And I'll put the same question to you regarding the period prior to democratic Kampuchea. Since there were obvious relations between Vietnam and those who were going to be the leaders of democratic Kampuchea, during that period as well, it was a situation the same. That is to say that the Soviet Union had information only with regard to what Vietnam said about their revolutionary leaders during the period from 1970 to 1975.
Yes, the Soviets only had information from the Vietnamese side about what was happening in Kampuchea from 70 to 75. However, I should point out that I used captured documents from the war, from the wartime, to try and understand what was happening inside Cambodia between 1970 and 75. Documents which were captured by the United States, not documents that I found in the Soviet archives.
Je vais revenir sur...
I will revisit that period. That is the period prior to 1975. But as a follow-up to a remark you made yesterday in answer to a question put to you by my colleague Copé on the issue of the criticisms made by Chandler of your book, you stated, as many critics of your book and many historians, and I quote, it was before yesterday, slightly before 14 hours 19, you state the following: like many historians who criticize my book, their criticisms did not have to do with history, but to political science, which I find ironical and irrational. The argument that the Indo-Chinese conflict was irrational, as opposed to the solidity and the relevance of my factual findings, end of quote. I would like to use your statements to now quote a passage from Chandler's criticism of your book. And this is what he says inter alia, and his document E3/10703. And the ERN in English is 01335287, and the ERN is only in English. So he gives two examples on pages 68 and 72 of your book, and you understand what he's referring to. And let me point out that I'll be quoting in English.
On page 68 and elsewhere, Maurice lambasted the Khmer Rouge for their bracket unrealistic and bracket irrational foreign relations, but fails to suggest what a sensible policy toward Vietnam might have been, aside from succumbing to Vietnamese patronage and demands. Vietnam itself, in any case, soon embarked on a similarly bracket irrational policy toward China, drawing less on Marxist-Leninist quarrels or paranoia, as Maurice seems to suggest, than on perceptions of threats to sovereignty based in part on historico-cultural considerations. On page 72, Maurice claims that there is bracket little independent evidence that the Thai and Vietnamese were attacking Cambodia in 1976. In fact, a mass of Khmer Rouge documents that deal with national defense have surfaced in Phnom Penh since Maurice completed his research. These materials suggest that from 70 onward, frequent skirmishes along Cambodia's borders, initiated by Thai, Vietnamese, and Khmer forces, and probably springing from trigger happiness in many cases, helped to intensify Pol Pot's belief that Cambodia was surrounded by enemies. End of quote. Cette longue citation de la critique, enfin, la revue, on va dire, de Chandler de votre ouvrage.
Oh, this long excerpt from Chandler in his review about your book to let you know more specifically that his critique of your book is not so much this in-depth analysis of the Soviet archives, but rather the fact that since your essential source to develop each person's position which do not incorporate contemporaneous elements of decay, explained that there might be something lacking for you to have a more complete and nuanced vision of the situation. So would you like to react to Chandler's critique in this regard? And don't you see an issue here? And there hasn't been an update as well regarding other elements that might have been found later on. My colleague tells me that I made a mistake in the quote by quoting the date of 1970 instead of 1976. So I was indeed speaking about 1976 here, if there was a bit of confusion here.
Yes, well, I won't apologize for not having read documents which surfaced after my book was completed. I'm sorry that I did not have the opportunity to read these documents before I completed my book. I would like very much to see these documents and to evaluate them and to try and determine whether they reflected the reality of the situation on the ground in Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So that would be my response to Mr. Chandler's comment. One has to be careful, of course, in using documents. It depends what these documents are. And since I don't know the answer to that question, you may well know what kinds of documents they were. You're in a better position than I am.
I understand, of course, that it's not in the short amount of time allotted to you that we'll be able to inform you of all of the documents that we have, but I just wanted to understand your reaction, and you answered, and I take note of this. Another point that I would like to develop with you, which appears to me to be interesting with relation to your expertise, you spoke at length about Marxist-Leninist regimes, you spoke at length about paranoia, and I would like to specifically ask you if this paranoia was not inherent to this particular period, which was the Cold War. So my first question is, therefore, during the Cold War, whether it be the way information was obtained as well as the strategic alliances that were developed, wasn't this a very special period, whether it be for Vietnam or the Soviet Union, but also for Cambodia?
Yes, it was a special period, but not everybody reacted to it in a paranoid way. And I've attempted to explain why the claims of conspiracy were not credible in the previous discussion with the civil party. That is, the conspiracies which were attributed to enemies of the regime involved collaboration between countries and institutions which had no close relationship, on the contrary, were adversarial. The KGB and the CIA. And that is why I have come to the conclusion that a lot of these reports of conspiracies represented paranoia. It's simply not credible that the KGB and the CIA were collaborating on behalf of the Soviet Union and the United States to overthrow the government of Democratic Kampuchea.
Now, regarding this issue of this specific period and the treatment of information, I put a question to you earlier about the sources of the Soviet Union with regard to Democratic Kampuchea and with regard to the revolutionary movement before, and you told me that the sources the Soviet Union had essentially came from Vietnam, and you also said that you had worked with Mr. Dmitry Muzyakov. So I wanted to ask you, or to look at an excerpt of a document that he wrote, and this is document E3/9644. And it begins at ERN French 001253111, English 0108593, Khmer 011200084. So this will give time to the parties to find this excerpt. But before, I'll put a preliminary question to you. So, in the archives that you looked at, do you remember elements or specific conversations in the reports that you saw linked or describing a desire by the Soviet Union to meet the leaders of the Khmer Rouge movement?
No, I did not.
Well, in this document, which I'm going to quote from right now, Mr. Muzyakov speaks about a conversation that took place in April 1974 between the Soviet ambassador in Phom Bong Dong and I'm sorry, I'm at the wrong page. Between the Soviet ambassador, I meant, and Hong Vang Tin, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, in April 1974, during which the ambassador asked to meet Khieu Samphan, whom he believed was the leader of the Khmer Rouge movement. And in the excerpt that I mentioned previously, this is what is stated. So this is a little bit before the passage I referred to just a few minutes ago. So it is explained here that Khieu Samphan is not the most senior person in DK and or in the Khmer Rouge movement, and the Soviet leaders did not know this. And this is what was said about Vietnam. So the relations between Moscow and the Khmer Rouge could not develop unless the main leaders among the Khmer Rouge movement would participate in the process. However, the Vietnamese were doing their best to prevent any direct contact between Moscow and the authorities of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, because they wanted to prevent someone else to monopolize relations with the Khmer Rouge, which the Vietnamese enjoyed. Since they were aware that Moscow would obviously have doubts about Hanoi's real intention to contribute to the relations between the Communist Party of Soviet Union and the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Vietnamese authorities kept on saying that the Vietnamese Workers' Party was making all efforts possible to contribute to the development of relations between the Soviet and Cambodian comrades. And then the author quotes the report of this meeting. So, does this refresh your memory? And do you remember having read either in the Soviet archives or elsewhere this statement?
Just very quickly, unless I missed it, I don't think Council gave the date of this, which was April 1974. So it wasn't DK authorities, but just so the experts are aware.
Yes, in any case, in French, I said it was April 1974, yes.
Donc,
so, my question is, does this excerpt refresh your memory? And, well, that's my first question.
Unfortunately, it does not refresh my memory. I had not seen that document. I'm not aware of that document. And Mr. Masyakov was doing some of his own work in the archives at the same time as he was helping me, and I regret that he didn't show me this document.
So my question in relation to my previous questions relative to how information was managed during the Cold War and regarding the alliances that were developed. So this is an illustration of Vietnam's diplomacy. So wasn't it inherent to the Cold War period, and in particular in relation to what was described concerning the way of managing diplomacy on the Vietnamese side, wasn't it their strategy to hide information based on some kind of agenda that they had?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment.
So in relation with this period again, we all know, and this is part of the elements that were discussed here, that there were border conflicts, aside from other issues between Vietnam and Democratic Kampuchea. So in your book, you spoke about the turbulent past between Vietnam and Cambodia and the neighboring countries. So my specific question now is, did you conduct any research with regard to the border issues and with regard to the Brevia line in particular, or this is something that you did not concern yourself with at all?
No, this is not something I concern myself with.
de façon...
Generally speaking, so here I will be speaking about Cambodia's issues with Vietnam or with Thailand. Were these border issues, generally speaking, at the heart of your research? Because earlier you were questioned about a certain number of telegrams regarding the border issues with Thailand. And so you can now confirm that these issues with Thailand were also not at part of your research.
No, maybe I expressed myself. It's not that they were not part of my research. They were not the primary focus. I didn't focus as much on these issues as some people might have. But it's not correct to say that they were not part of my research.
So, with regarding these border issues, did you, for example, in your research, study Thailand's position, Cambodia's position, and Vietnam's position with regard to how the area was mapped out, which was inherited from the colonial period? So that is my specific question with regard to the border conflicts and with regard to the discussions that took place concerning these border problems.
Look, I read about these issues, but in terms of what my focus was, it wasn't my focus because I thought that the border issues were a reflection of more profound political problems. The border issues were not the cause of what happened, that they were a symptom of what happened, or of deeper causes. But I'm certainly well aware of the problems that Cambodia has with its border with Vietnam and the problems of mapping out borders and so on.
I do not know if you're familiar with a report that was produced on 20 August 1975 by Australia's embassy in Hanoi, but apparently these issues of Vietnam's influence over Cambodia was something that was noted by numerous observers, and I'm referring to document E3/9723, ERN English 0118695, Khmer 01310869, and there is no French version. So I would like to focus on paragraph 14. So this is a memo that was addressed by the Australian embassy in Hanoi to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it sums up the issues that came up in the following way, and this is in paragraph 14.
Beyond this, there are the suspected Vietnamese aspirations to form an Indo-Chinese federation, which are believed to be unacceptable to the Cambodians. Moreno says he believes the Vietnamese will make no strong moves towards such a regime until their application for United Nations and non-aligned group membership are out of the way. Locke also says these are the Vietnamese priorities. But in saying this, he implicitly admits that these Vietnamese ambitions do exist and time is unlikely to make them more palatable to the Cambodians. End of quote.
So my question is the following. So in your research, were you able to note that this concern and this observation made by the Australian ambassador is something that was taken up by other embassies, and is this something that was mentioned as well in the Soviet archives that you consulted?
I think there was a discussion earlier yesterday about from an excerpt from my book where I quote the Soviet authorities talking about an Indo-Chinese federation in 1973. But apart from that, I did not find any information about the Indo-Chinese Federation from other embassies or other countries.
Now, returning to parts of your book, you explained in your book the different steps in Vietnam's behavior in its management of its conflict with democratic Cambodia. In particular, you spoke about the issue of the change of language when you were speaking to the co-prosecutor. He quoted this. He spoke about democratic Cambodia and the Pol Pot Ieng Sari clique, and we call this propaganda today. People today might call this aspects of language. But so my question is: was this something that was frequent during the Cold War and in communist countries? Was this usage of different forms of language common when alliances changed between countries?
Yes, it was. You would find, for example, the Soviet Union using different descriptions of the government of Yugoslavia before and after Tito's split with the Soviet Union in 1948. So yes, this use of language is very important to indicate attitude.
In your book, and this is at page 105 of document E3/7338, English ERN, at the end of page 01001772, and you speak about the beginning of 1978, and I will quote in English.
Within the first 4 months of 78, the Vietnamese had created a secret network of camps for the purpose of building a liberation army of Cambodians from among refugees and other civilians brought from Cambodia to Vietnam. Vous dites,
And you say as well, and this time it's on page 109, ERN 01001776. And here you speak about the meeting in September 1978 between Le Duan and the Russian ambassador, and you say the following.
je sais plus si j'ai donné le...
So the ERN is indeed 01001776. And I will quote in English again.
Le Duan also spoke of the efforts that Vietnam had undertaken in promoting a Cambodian resistance. He claimed that there were 9 battalions of Khmer trained by the Vietnamese operating at that time. There were also to be 20 leaders of provincial districts coming out against the Phnom Penh regime and sympathizing with Vietnam. Fin de citation.
End of quote. So my question is, well, of course, we understand that this is the result of a discussion that took place between Le Duan and the Russian ambassador. So my question is, in your research, did you obtain any details about this issue of 9 battalions and of the 20 provincial district leaders who joined the cause, the Vietnamese cause?
No, I don't have any more details. Had I had more details, I would certainly have included them, if not in the text, at least in a footnote.
Vous avez
You also spoke about this rapprochement that took place between Vietnam and the Soviet Union in your book after Vietnam's first courting of China. This rapprochement that you said was perceived in a very negative way by China, that believed that it was the Vietnamese being ungrateful. And you said in your book that discussions that then led to a friendship treaty between Moscow and Hanoi took place in 1978. And you say the following, and I will quote again in English. So this is at ERN 010017775.
not openly discussed. One purpose of the meeting was for the Vietnamese to ensure Soviet political and military backing in any future escalation, or at least to provide a Soviet insurance policy against possible Chinese military retaliation. The Soviets had no intention of going to war with China over Vietnam and Cambodia, but naturally did not reveal that view. But a treaty of friendship and cooperation will be publicly signed in Moscow in November. End of quote.
So this desire to come closer to the Soviet Union, which was a giant against the Chinese giant back then, reveals some kind of strategic calculation on the part of Vietnam. So with regard to this desire to come closer to the Soviet Union, in your research, did you obtain any elements on the diplomatic offensive that Vietnam carried out when it was considering invading Cambodia? And what were the possible diplomatic alliances that took place then, that is to say at the end of 1977 and the beginning of 1978? Or throughout the year 1978, corrects the interpreter.
I did not go into the diplomatic offensive, but I believe that the Vietnamese regarded their best prospects for achieving their objectives in Cambodia to be having the support of the Soviet bloc, that is, the nations which are under the influence or control of the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe in particular. I'm not familiar with, I'm familiar with the Vietnamese propaganda campaign during this time, but not of diplomatic efforts with non-bloc countries. I think that, however, the Vietnamese did try to, in their propaganda, to influence international public opinion against the authorities in democratic Kampuchea.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I see the time now is 11:30. Can we go on break now? I'll move into another line of questioning on other documents when we resume.
Councillor Antakishe, you know how much time do you anticipate?
j'aurais besoin, je pense.
I believe I'll need all the time allotted to me. I have 25 more minutes left. I know that we do these kinds of calculations. According to my calculations, I need 25 minutes and no less, and that is the time that I still have left, Mr. President.
Thank you, Counsel, and thank you, Mr. Expert. It is now time for our lunch break. We take a break now and resumed at 1:30 this afternoon. To continue our proceedings, Court Officer, please assist the expert at the waiting room reserved for experts and witnesses during the break time, and invite him back into the courtroom at 1:30. Security personnel, you are instructed to take Kiew Sampon to the waiting room downstairs and have him returned to attend the proceedings this afternoon. Before 1:30, the court is now in recess.